hopefully just have more of a discussion and dialogue about some of the issues that I talked about. I'm certainly happy to, this is a workshop, so I have no PowerPoint slides. I know you're sad about that. Some people hate them, I actually love them. But, you know, we wanted to just have a chance to have more, as I said, of a dialogue or conversation about anything that was raised when I spoke earlier today. I had a few topics that I thought might be of interest, or we can probably just decide what we want to talk about and have a conversation around that. So a few things that were on my mind. We didn't really get a chance to talk more in depth about kind of the history of race in education and just how that comes into play, which is very much a part of the achievement disparities. You know, it's certainly we talk about it by income level, and it's probably more comfortable to talk about it in that way instead of like pulling out like the race cards, you'll say. But race and class are so intertwined in the history of our country, and so not surprisingly, achievement disparities are very much by race as well. So we can get into some of the history and dynamics of that. There's often the question people ask, like, well, I'm a college student, like, what can I do now? Like, getting sort of more practical with, like, so if I want to do something on this issue today, what are the options? You know, how can I jump into that? There might be questions about, you know, some of your education majors having some more specific questions about teaching in that type of school. You know, what are sort of the, you know, lessons learned, like, how did you do that, if you want to break that down more. And then kind of jumping off of education, you know, a lot of people in your generation, the millennials, as you all recall, I just have a high rate of people who want to start organizations and are social entrepreneurs. And so I started an organization about 3 years ago, and definitely can talk about that. There's lots of things we could get into, questions around that. And then just being in leadership and running an organization, there's a ton, I think, around that. Certainly in the Christian context, there are gender dynamics at play in leading an organization. I'm obviously a woman. And so I get asked surprisingly a lot of questions about that. Well, I shouldn't say surprisingly. Anyway, we can go in those directions, or none of those, or some other place if you all want to, but those are some of the things that based on what I've heard from people since I've been here on campus, and like little questions that have come up. So, but I want to see what you guys want to talk about, and if you can introduce yourself, maybe we can start by that and have people just quickly say who they are, what your major is, and maybe like one thing you'd like to get out of this time together, and we can make it super quick and we can get through everyone. If that's okay. Does that sound good? Okay. We'll start back here.
Jeremy Casey, students mathematics.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to get out of this time, or just want to learn more?
For the listener, let the students get theirs if there's a law left.
Okay. That's good.
Music composition. Just some discussion. I like being part of. Passion towards it. So, like how we can make things better.
Great.
I'm Joyce New. I'm a systems
questions about that, and why don't we just start there, and I'll just talk for not that long, and then we can just have more of a conversation. And feel free to disagree with me, like push back if there are things that you're like, but it doesn't seem like that's what's happening in our schools, and then we can jump into some of the more specifics, and we probably will just end up doing sort of Q&A so you can get your specific questions out, even though I've heard some of them, just to make sure I don't miss what folks want to hear. But like I mentioned, I think it's a lot easier in our nation to talk about issues of educational inequality across lines of class, because it's just not as charged as race is in this country. It still is, and I see that a lot where it's just more comfortable, easier to sort of say, oh, this is an issue that impacts only like kids that are poor, and not really going below the surface to look at like what are the racial dynamics there. And when you look at our nation, in terms of sheer numbers, right, there are more white people that are living in poverty, sheer numbers, right, because there's more white people in this country. But when you break it down in terms of proportion, like what percent of African Americans and Latinos in particular versus percent of white people living in poverty, the percentages are higher for people of color. And so there's just, particularly for those two groups, and some groups in Asian American cultures as well. So there's this really interesting, sort of depressing intersection of race and class in this country. And when people ask, why we see achievement disparities among African Americans, and I'll just talk about that to start, and white and Asian groups, or some Asian groups, it's a tough one, because I don't think it can only be sort of identified as a poverty-related issue, in part because there's these really depressing statistics that look at academic achievement disparities among African American students from middle and upper middle class families who are living in suburban communities, and the achievement gap is actually still there. It's not as stark, but there is still a disparity. So, from my perspective, surprisingly, I don't think African Americans are less intelligent or anything like that, shocker. And I think most people at our core don't, but what else is going on? And so for me, as a student of education, but also I'm sort of a armchair sociologist, I think I just want to kind of understand the interactions there. And so in the book that I wrote, there are a couple of chapters that I devote just to looking at the history of race in education, because I think it is something we can't eliminate from this conversation. And so, it's not a surprise, I think, to any of us that schools were segregated, that there was a whole, season in our country where, prior to the segregation, African Americans, Black folks weren't allowed to learn, right, during slavery like that. So there's that history. There's segregation for African Americans, but then for Native American kids, they were literally, in many cases, put into schools to try to basically take away any part of their cultural heritage, and were basically taught in many cases that, if you want to be smart and be successful, you have to disavow, part of your community. Latino kids were prohibited from attending schools with white kids too. So, all of that history is history. And so you can sort of look at that and say, well, that happened, it's in the past. Like, everyone can go to any school that they want to now. Like, what's the root of that, and why does that still matter or doesn't matter today? And I think there's an argument to be made on both sides. Like, maybe that history doesn't necessarily impact what's happening in 2014. Maybe it does. I think it's an open question. But I think what we see now, so that's sort of the history of how we got here, and in how schools, in some cases ended up being having the challenges they do today. What the issue of race now, where I think it's really coming into play more from my perspective, is actually neighborhood segregation, right? Because most neighborhoods are pretty racially divided in this country. I think it's pretty rare statistically, and I think from all of our experiences, to find a neighborhood that's really integrated kind of at the levels that, proportionate to the different types of races in our country. And so part of that's because of economics, right? I mean, if people have money, they can afford to buy a house in a certain neighborhood, and if people of color don't have as much money, they can't. I mean, all of that contributes to where people buy homes, and if neighborhoods are segregated, that just naturally spills over into schools. And obviously there's no legal segregation of residential segregation anymore. People can, in theory, buy a house wherever they want to, but I mean, where I live in DC, the city is like literally divided, pretty much by the river, the Anacostia River, but the houses in Northwest DC for like a 3-bedroom bungalow are like probably on the average of like 1.5 million for like a fixer-upper on the northwest side of DC, and the schools over there are awesome. Like, people think Washington DC doesn't have great public schools. If you can afford to buy that house over there, they're gonna be amazing. Again, not surprisingly, it's disproportionately white inside of the city. Across the river in Anacostia, most people are renting their homes. You know, you can probably buy a house for $100,000, which in DC is really cheap. I know it's not cheap for the rest of the world, but it's cheap there, and it's overwhelmingly African American. And so it's that type of segregation that is still happening in our schools. And I mean, I don't know, I'd be curious what you all think. Is integration, having schools in resident and neighborhoods be more racially integrated, is that a potential solution to achievement disparities? I'll put that question out to you all. And there's, you know, I think people are debating this and have been for years, because in my grandparents' generation, like, that was what we were shooting for. Like, get the integration and it will change everything. Now we kind of have de facto segregation still. Would integrating neighborhoods and schools be a way to potentially get at some of the achievement disparities we see? What do you all think? No right or wrong answer.
Maybe it would, because part of it would be that the resources.
Speak up a little bit, speak up.
The resources that would be are available generally to more white schools and stuff like that would make it more accessible to people in general, but that's not necessarily because of integration, it's just one of the side effects.
So maybe there's more resources that kids would have if they were able to go. I mean, so do we, I'm being a little bit of a devil's advocate, or just trying to push the conversation, so then do we force communities to integrate in terms of where they send their kids to school? I mean, the 70s was all about like mandatory busing, and you know, look back at the history that maybe didn't go over so well in some communities for people. Do we think that's the way to go? Should we like just force schools to be racially integrated as a potential solution? What if, I'm not just you, but anyone, what do we think is that something we think would be helpful?
I wouldn't say like forcing schools to be more integrated. I think like if it's at all possible for neighborhoods to have different ranges of house values, that would probably help integrate it more.
So like mixed income communities. So that's, I think that's something that people are trying to do in some places. I think even in a lot of suburban communities, they're really trying to have, you know, everything from, you know, a 6,000 square foot house to a townhouse to apartments, all kind of in the same neighborhood. So lots of people from different incomes, and again, since income often follows race in this country, that would potentially bring more racial diversity to a neighborhood, to the schools. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So maybe not forced, forced integration, because again, I don't know, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't, but that hasn't always gone over so well. There was a town, and I met someone earlier from St. Louis, I don't know if she's in here, or the Q&A, or book table, but there was a town in St. Louis that, a suburban community that had a phenomenal school district, and right next to it, another sort of suburban community had more economic challenges, and the school district had so many struggles that it went into sort of state receivership, so the state took it over. And so one of the options that the state decided was that the kids could go to school anywhere. And so most of the families then went to enroll their kids into this like really awesome suburban school district right next to it because it was close to it. And what do you all think? How do you think that went over? Like, any thoughts, any hypotheses? How that went? Yes, people should have heads.
Yeah, I can imagine parents would be, oh, now we have bigger class sizes, now we have less resources for our kids. These people they don't live here, they shouldn't get these things. I can imagine, just as I've seen parents interact with their children and what they want for their children, I can imagine that probably didn't go over very well.
Yeah, so no, it didn't. And it was unfortunate because the conversation got to be pretty ugly, you know, and it's tough because as a parent, I understand the tension of like, my class sizes are going to increase. There are students who are now coming to our school district who are bringing a set of challenges because a lot of the kids were in schools where they were just behind. And so now, gosh, there's kids coming that don't know how to read. Is that going to take away from attention that my child gets in the class because now there's a group of kids who need more? But then it became kind of racially charged in this sort of like uncomfortable language that we sometimes use and not wanting to say the word, but like it kind of was the undercurrent, and it got really contentious to the point where the school district and the wealthier school district voted down and like had a new rule that, I don't forget the legality of it, but they basically banned that school district from being able to send their kids to their school district. And this is like the messiness of like, we're talking about race, we're talking about, school policy, how do we, if race is such a component of this, it just becomes incredibly messy. And, every parent wants the best for their child, like I deeply believe that, but that includes this idea of if we want to make things more equitable, then do some people have to give up some things they already have? Like, that doesn't seem like super like American in terms of our value system, because we're supposed to be all striving for getting the most that we can. It was a really interesting conversation. So back to this racial component of this work, I think there are a lot of people that would say, given the challenges of trying to sort of merge school districts and mesh school districts, not that we can and try mixed income living, like at the end of the day, we have to make sure that every school, no matter where a child lives, is high quality. And, my parents, who I mentioned, when they were really little, segregation was still happening in some of their schools, because it was kind of before things were officially, formally desegregated, even though Brown had already happened, Brown versus Board. My dad's like, we went to all black schools in North Carolina, but they were actually good. And so from his perspective, he's like, not that I want to go back to that time where we couldn't go to other schools, but he's like, from his perspective, he's like, if every school's good, every school just should be good, and regardless of who's attending that school. And so there are a lot of people who feel like that's really the core of it, and that's kind of the way we talk about our work, is making each school good, because that seems easier to do than trying to manage all of the other dynamics of changing neighborhood boundaries and getting at the economic inequalities and the residential segregation. I don't know if that's the right answer, but for a lot of us working on education, it seems like you can get your head around that more, even though it's really hard to do, a really good school anywhere, but it just seems more navigable. And then the theory is that if a school is 100% African American and it's great, those kids are gonna have a great education. I think from a value standpoint, I think the world's better when people are in integrated settings. I think you learn more. All of that I totally believe in, but getting to that just seems like it might take longer, and I feel like, we're trying to work all that out. Kids in this school still can't read, so like, can we just have the kids read who are here, and then maybe some of that will fix itself? I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of babbling a bit, but what do you all think about that? Because I think it's just incredibly complicated and a little messy. Any thoughts?
Seems like a realistic way to seize for a goal that is actually achievable. That is not the way to it's not realistically something by you and your organizational ideas.
Yeah, we can't solve probably racial integration in our organization's lifetime, but yeah. Any other thoughts on that? On just the racial dynamic? I know we're just jumping into like the most complicated, controversial topic, and I don't know you all at all, and so you may not want to bare your souls, and that's totally fine, but yeah, I'm just curious if that brings up anything else for anyone.
I think like keeping the, like what you said, each school being like a good school, it's good, and like keep, like even if like all the African Americans go to that school, then you can like keep the cultural identity as like an African American school as well. But like achieving like the good standard would, like you have a good standard of education as well as keeping your own cultural identity. But I think maybe like the education like will have like what you're studying probably should like have the whole package, like getting to know what the whites think, even though you are in an African American school.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think if we're going to prepare kids to like live in like a very pluralistic, like internationally pluralistic world, like yeah, kids have to be able to relate to lots of other folks, and I think, and people have different ideas. There are a lot of people who would also say, and but some people would say school choice is the way to kind of get at this. Are you all familiar with charter schools and school vouchers? Yeah. So with the idea of having parents in communities without a lot of options have the ability to choose another school across town. And so instead of like the case in St. Louis, it's like, a few hundred kids coming out to the suburbs, it's a few kids whose parents are making those options. And so they're finding other schools as a way to not necessarily have to stay in a school that maybe is racially or economically segregated, but you can have other choices. But again, I think the challenge is there are never going to be enough spots in sort of the high-performing schools for everyone to sort of pick and choose and move out of the community to go to those schools like I did when I was a kid. And so we have to really still focus on making sure that every school is a good school, because every parent's not going to have the means or the transportation to get their kid everywhere to go to those schools. Let's open up for just questions, and we can go off this topic if people are sort of done sort of ruminating on this at like on a Saturday afternoon. But what other questions do folks have that they want to jump into? Yeah.
You mentioned earlier today, something about like you can choose to do the immediate the immediate good, but then you could also choose to do like the long-term good in education. What, like whether it be like government with policy making or administration or teaching like in a classroom setting, what do you think gives the greatest ability to do long-term good? Where have you seen the most long-term good come from in your experience?
So the best long-term good, I mean, I would say where the real action is probably at the school level. So if you want to see long-term systemic change, honestly, being a school leader is probably where you're going to get the most traction, because you're not only impacting a classroom of 30 kids, right? You're impacting a school of 700 or a couple thousand kids, depending on the size. And that's where I think the biggest return has been on shifting our culture, because it's a fairly contained piece. Like, you are managing and hiring, and to some extent your entire staff, so you can pick, if you're a good principal, you're going to find a way to get the best teachers to come to your school because they're going to want to work with you. And then you're changing the trajectory for kids, not just 1 year of school, but of, in elementary school, it's like, 6 years of school, you're changing, kindergarten through 5th grade, and then you're really putting them on a dramatically different trajectory. If you have a teacher who is able to keep your child, catch them up from the achievement disparities and keep them above grade level for 6 years in a row, like, they're going to be really set for middle school, or set for high school, or set for college. And so that, I think, is a wonderful way to do systemic change. I think school leadership is phenomenal. The other piece for me, I would say, is at probably at the local level in terms of school district leadership and school board leadership. And I know, like, no one votes in school board elections. It's like low turnout, but really, like, that is where the action is. Like, these are individuals who are making decisions about the entire school district. We have a couple of pastors in our network in Indianapolis that ran for school board. They didn't win this time around, but they just had school board elections last week. And to see two prominent clergy running for school board and saying, like, we think this position matters because for what we just talked about, right? Like, this is a game changer for, thousands of kids in Indianapolis public schools. Like, I think that is an undersold opportunity. And honestly, if I could get, like, our pastors and, like, church leaders to, like, really have a commitment to, consider running for a local office on the local school board level, what an awesome example of the church really being invested in our communities. And I think that's a pretty phenomenal way to bring change. And again, kind of overlooked and not seen as, like, the most exciting thing, but it's where the action is, those two levels. Other questions? Everyone going to run for school board now? Since you're of age. You're actually of age now, run for school board. Other questions or thoughts? You can share your feedback.
As college students, we could possibly only be here in our community for 4 years. Maybe some of us will stay in Upland. And we're also pretty busy at the same time. But if we do feel called to somehow practice everyday activism in this environment in the local school, what are tangible ways that you see we as college students could do to enact maybe the short term, or maybe begin to enact the long term kind of change and systemic change we want
Yes,
to see?
so we believe the best people that are going to be long-term advocates are people that have some experience in public schools. You don't have to be a teacher, but I don't know what the school systems are right around here, but I imagine there are needs, because there are needs in most school districts to lesser or higher degrees. And if there's not already a group of students that are tutoring and supporting some of the schools around here, I think that's just a wonderful way to start that, and really asking schools what the needs are, and having that as a part of an option and as a way to volunteer and serve. A lot of college campuses do that, and it's just a great way to be role models for kids who maybe they don't know anyone who's in college or whatnot. That's one piece. I really do believe studying this issue and doing a small group discussion. I don't know if you all have small groups on campus, Bible studies, but obviously I'm sure your Bible studies, this is Taylor, but we and a couple of other organizations have created some curriculum that people can use to really discuss this issue over the course of 4 or 5 weeks and start to bring other people into this issue, because that's where people get motivated to do that work, right? And then the final thing I would say is, I don't know where you're registered to vote, and we are a nonprofit organization, so we don't tell people who to vote for. We're not allowed to do that. But really thinking about how you can get involved in some advocacy. Honestly, I would do it here in Indiana because that's where you are and that's where your residence is a lot of the year. There's so much need at the state level in Indiana for significant change. I mean, Indiana's come a long way, but there's a lot that still have to be done. I talked about early childhood education earlier today. I mean, there's just the ability to really lift up your voice and write letters to members of Congress to get your churches that you go to, here or back at home if you live in Indiana full time, to get involved in this issue. And our organization, our website, I'm happy to connect you to our local staff here in Indianapolis, who would be more than happy to have more people who are going to get folks in their Christian community to speak out about this issue, because we're nowhere near done with this work in Indiana. There's a lot still to be done to ensure kids have a high quality education, especially around early childhood. And it's easy to do from your laptop. Other questions or thoughts?
I have a question. Just like specifically from somebody in the field, or going to the field of education, from my perspective, because sometimes I think sometimes it's overwhelming for me to think about going into a field that it's one of obviously one of the largest institutions in our country, but at the same time it is so broken. And so I guess maybe what is your advice, or just like what? Because I think sometimes I can be an idealist at times, and so it's like how.
Not too bad.
Yeah, but like how. Because when something is so broken, it's like how do you as one person start to try to make an impact on that, or how do you not lose hope seeing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think with any issue that we want to take on and want to make a difference in, I think it's figuring out how you can uniquely make an impact on that issue. And so for me, initially in this field, it was I could uniquely make an impact on this issue by going and being a classroom teacher in Compton and really trying my best to help my kids achieve at high levels. And part of what kept me motivated, well, certainly I had 2 amazing Christian roommates, and we prayed daily for our kids and for each other. But it was just this deep, unwavering belief that it was possible. And that's somewhat idealistic. I was sharing with some young women earlier that part of it was just naivete, thinking at 22 I could go out and help kids learn in Compton. There's a little bit of naivete, but I think that's actually not a bad thing, because that's how the world gets changed. There's someone who thinks something's possible that everyone else is laughing at them, or in my case, my parents were like, "You're going what? You're going where?" My friends were like, "Oh my gosh, moving to Compton." But that's actually a good thing, and so I wouldn't say to lose some of that, right? You have to have some imagination and scope beyond of what you see to be able to make an impact. Otherwise, you would just keep doing what everyone else is doing. You wouldn't think beyond that. So it's whatever that sort of unique ways that you can make an impact, and just having a pretty big, sometimes maybe crazy vision for that particular area you want to impact. And then I think you'll figure it out, right? I mean, I knew for me staying in the classroom for 30 years wasn't what I was called to do, and I think some people are, and it's amazing. But for some of us, I think God takes us on different journeys of, for me it was sort of the policy piece. For some people it might be, I want to start, a urban Christian school, because I think kids need Christian ministry and high academics. I mean, there's just lots of ways to do that. So I think for now is just jump in where you see the need and have a pretty ambitious vision, and don't be afraid of that. And you will figure out where you're best suited, I think, to impact the problem. I'm glad that you want to work on this issue. Don't be afraid of it. It's good. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, in your experience, what does it take to improve a school district? Or does it take
So did folks hear that question, how we improve the school district? Is it money, is it resources, and how long does it really take? I think I would love to say like more money will solve this problem. I'm just not convinced anymore that that's the case, which is sort of scary to say, because I feel like once you say that, people are like, right, do what you have with no money then, figure it out, and no one wants to pay more taxes, right? But I just think we have a history of looking at school districts that have incredibly high per pupil expenditures that have not moved the needle on student achievement in like 40 years and have continually increased the amount of money they're giving to schools. And we as a nation have done that, and the achievement gaps have actually gotten a little wider over the last 40 years. So it's not just money. Now, obviously, like, schools need to have adequate funding, like I think teachers should get paid more, that would probably help. But at the end of the day, everyone's an education major, like, let's pay the teachers more. But at the end of the day, I think it really is a human capital issue and a human capacity issue, really at the teacher and school leader level. Like, if I could invest all of the resources and sort of the good thinking, smart thinking into helping to recruit, train, and support teachers and principals more effectively, I feel like we would get so much further with that. Because, again, like, teachers that are at the top of there's like a bell curve in every profession, right? Sorry, teachers, there is for teachers too. The teachers who are on one end of the bell curve are seeing like dramatic gains with their students. The teachers who are on the far end of the bell curve, sometimes they're losing ground with their students every year. And then there's a chunk of us, most of us are in the middle, and we're like, we're getting a year's worth of growth, maybe a little more, a little less. Like, there's so much research that shows that there are ways that we can move more of the teachers in the middle to be on that further end of the bell curve so they can be more effective. But it gets at how we start training you all, how we start convincing people to go into teaching in the first place. Who are we getting? How are we attracting them? Are we getting enough math and science majors who want to teach math and science instead of the rest of us who maybe don't have that skill set of trying to teach elementary and middle school math? It shouldn't have been me. It should have been someone else with more knowledge of that subject. But then how do we train them? How do we support them when they're in the classroom? Because it's just very hard to do that and do it well. Like, I would put most of my resources there. And then there's this sad little thing that we have to do. We actually have to evaluate teachers, y'all. Like, if you're going to be a teacher, like, embrace the evaluation. Like, it just needs to be evaluated. It doesn't have to be scary. But there's so much backlash in our country right now about evaluating teachers. I have a lot of opinions about that, about where that's coming from. But that shouldn't actually be a bad thing. We should actually welcome that idea of getting feedback. I run a nonprofit. My board evaluates me every year, and if I'm not getting it done, I fully expect to be given some support to try to improve, and eventually, if I'm still not getting it done, I would expect them to say, thank you for your services, Nicole, like, we need to find someone else. Like, it's just not the right fit for you. And, like, we have to be okay with that. Human teachers, I know no one wants to say that, but embrace the evaluation, because ultimately, it's for our good and for us to help improve. So, again, no one loves it, but I hope people learn to love it, because you really ought to want the feedback. Student teachers, you get feedback every day, right? In student teaching, it should continue throughout your career. Otherwise, how are you going to get better? So that's where I would put my money and my effort. How long that will take? I would say it would take a good 10 years to really change a school district dramatically. We have a few that are probably halfway through that really rigorous process, and we'll see where they are in 5 years.
That's about a little bit less than the time it takes to get a whole class all the way through.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so kids are graduating, and we're not there yet, and that's pretty ambitious. Honestly, some people probably say it takes a full generation, which I guess is technically 20 years. It's a little hard for me to sit on the 20-year mark, because I'm like, then you miss a whole generation of kids in the school district, and they don't get what they need.
If you say like teacher evaluation, who should they get their feedback?
They should get their feedback from other teachers, from other high-quality teachers should be evaluating teachers, because they're the ones that are doing it every day, and they should be giving peer feedback. Of course, the principal will evaluate you, but I mean, honestly, when I was a teacher, my principal came in one time to evaluate me during the year, and it was like for literally 30 minutes, and like, and this is no judgment on him, the system wasn't in place, he was crazy overworked, right? But he checked off some boxes and was like, you're doing great. And like, I know that there were probably 1,000 things I could have gotten feedback on to help me improve my practice to make me a better teacher, but we didn't choose to invest in that in Compton, and we're not investing in it on large. And again, I shouldn't say it's just about the teacher evaluation, it's about then what do you do with the feedback you get? Like, our teachers getting the support they need to improve? Because telling me I'm doing 6 things wrong, but not helping me improve isn't helpful either. But you have to have a system that evaluates teachers in a fair way and then gives them really quality feedback and ways to improve. And I just didn't get that. I got it from teachers next door to me who came and helped me, but I didn't get it from the leadership there. They just didn't have the capacity to do it.
That to throw in another controversial topic. What do you think then the role in standardized testing is with teacher evaluation?
Yeah, so, that's not controversial at all. What do you think? So everyone is going to be a teacher, know all about standardized testing. So I was sharing this last night at dinner with Sam and Paige. We hung out a little bit last night. I actually think standardized testing, or I should say testing, is actually a good thing because honestly, as a teacher, I needed to assess my kids at the beginning of the year to know where they were and where they were strong and where they were behind. Otherwise, I wouldn't know what to do with them all year. I would just sort of teach the 5th grade curriculum and hope for the best. Well, most of my kids needed a 1st grade curriculum for reading and math, or 2nd grade. So I believe there's a need for that. And also lets us as a nation be held accountable for saying all the poor kids in this neighborhood are not doing well, we shouldn't be okay with that. We have to own that and just have the real hardcore data to know what to do with those disparities. So that aside, I personally believe that student growth should be a part of a teacher's evaluation. I don't think student outcomes necessarily should be because it's about growth, right? If I start off the year and have most of my kids are learning at 1st grade level, the goal for me as a 5th grade teacher should probably not be to have them at 6th grade by the end of the year. But a realistic goal may be to get them from 1st grade to 2nd and a half or almost 3rd grade in a year, and I should be given credit for that, right? Because that's, I think, a realistic and ambitious goal, sort of in the middle of that. Then I think that growth that I make should be a portion of a teacher's evaluation. I think it's crazy to think it should be the only way a teacher's evaluated because kids take the test on one day. And there's all of those things that we all know from how we test. Some days it's good, some days it's not as good. But on the average, looking at your class average growth, it should be a part of it because we're there to teach and help kids learn. And does it mean it should be the whole thing? No, someone should evaluate you and see how you're teaching. You should get feedback from parents. You should probably get feedback from students, about your class. And then you should weight all of that in consideration with the school, the demographics of the school. If you have many more kids who are speaking English as a 2nd language or who are living in poverty, there has to be some weight given to the challenge of teaching in that type of environment too. But I know that's a complicated answer, but it's a complicated issue. And to not include it when I hear, honestly, people in leading teaching groups saying that student achievement or student growth shouldn't be included at all in a teacher's evaluation, I'm well, please tell me why you're there then. If you're not there to teach the kids, and help them learn a little bit during the year, I just don't, I can't get my head around that. I know it's scary, I get it, but we're not saying we're going to fire you if, your kids don't grow. At least, that's not what I would say. Some people may, but I wouldn't say that. Yeah.
I also have something to kind of tangent. Do you think that teachers should teach the information or the topic?
Can you expand on that?
Test by the book or test, or teach the students a broad spectrum or what will be on the test?
What do you all think? Should teachers teach the broad topic, broad spectrum of topics for what's going to be on the test? What do you all think? Just to talk out, yeah.
I've had teachers go both ways with that, and I've loved it when a teacher teaches the subject and you get a really wide education on it. But I found when teachers just teach the test, it's no longer focused on learning; it's just focused on the grade, and I just did not enjoy that class.
Could you tell the difference when they were doing
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
There's a huge difference.
Yeah. What do you guys think?
Broad.
Broad. I can't say that phrase for some reason.
I think with that, we should reevaluate the test.
We should what?
Reevaluate the test.
Yeah. Say more about that.
And we have to have a way to grade students and
Sure.
show that there is growth.
It should be
and that-
objective, right? Yeah.
Right, but at the same point, if the real debate lies in what we should put on the test.
Totally agree. Yeah.
And so it's that decision that's really the weighting one, because we could standardize tests and tests in general could be great and show a perfect image of what the teacher is doing and show what the kid is doing, other than like, you know, like, how is the kid feeling that day?
Sure.
Just like stuff like that. But like, overall, we can say a standardized test can show a little bit of that, but what does it show if it's not the content we need on the test?
Yeah, I mean, so when I, talk about supporting, the idea of assessing student growth and having it be a part of teacher evaluation, there's a presupposition that the test actually is good. and that's a huge leap, like I get it, like there's some states the testing system is just like, like it's just not about anything, it's really weak and not at all rigorous, and probably tests memorization as opposed to like actual thinking. So I'm assuming that we need to up the ante on some of the state tests, so I should have probably said that, because I think your point is exactly right. Like, otherwise you're gonna have the class, like the young man with the fabulous bow tie said, you're just gonna be bored out of your mind because you're just being taught, little bits of information. The best teachers, which it takes years probably to get to this level, are able to make sure their kids are able to take sort of the basic the basic test, but go much further than that. And you don't have to teach to the test to get your kids to do that. But if they know a lot of the basic skills, you can sort of scaffold the learning, right, to go far beyond that once they've mastered that. And I would personally say, like, if my kids, my husband and I have 3 kids, if my kids could not pass a basic skills test in the state of Washington, D.C., I would be scared for their future as citizens of the world. So I actually want my kids to be able to pass that test. I just want them to do much more than that if the test is only basic. And I think that's the goal that all of us as teachers would have for our students too.
Playing off the whole basic skills thing, can you talk a little bit about if you're in a school where students are struggling with those basic skills, what role is coaching more specific skills?
Yeah, so this was a great question that came up earlier. If you're teaching like history, I think you said, and your kids are struggling with basic skills, how do you even begin to teach history, and like what is your role? I wish I had an easy answer for that, other than to say what should ideally happen is there should be reading resource teachers at the high school level too, to help capture kids and pull them out who are still not caught up on basic literacy. And so that's a question of like, is there funding for that? Is the program good? So, but that's the ideal. What most of my friends who taught high school did and still do is that they equip themselves to some extent. I know it's not fair. They equip themselves to some extent as reading resource teachers because they knew that they had to keep kids after school, and not keep them, but invite them to stay after school or during their free periods to come and get some of that reading sort of basic skills. Were they perfect reading resource teachers? No, but they were able to help kids with some pretty, fairly fundamental reading skills, whether it's on comprehension, in some cases fluency, to help them before they could begin to even get into the history piece. And I think it just makes it so much more challenging. And I can't really speak too much more to because that wasn't the subject area that I taught, other than to say it's hard. And to see that type of growth with elementary students is just easier than it is with high school students for all the reasons you say. And I know some of my friends who taught high school would try to find more age-appropriate books to still cover the history topic or whatever the subject matter was. Easier maybe to do in history and English than it would be when you're trying to teach chemistry to kids who are struggling with, like, I don't know, what do you need for chemistry, like fractions? I don't even know anymore. But whatever those math skills are, elementary school math skills you need to know chemistry, like that's even harder, I think, to catch kids up on that because it's so subject specific and most of us don't have knowledge on how to teach that. So I wish I had an easy answer for you. It's just harder. Do you have any thoughts on it? It sounds like you've been thinking about it.
Well, I had another question. You said that it's kind of important when going into a situation like that to preserve a certain sense of naivete to some extent, but it's probably also important to have a certain amount of wisdom or practice. Like,
Yeah, if I had to choose, I'd probably choose the wisdom rather than the naivete.
Right, like
Sure.
it says, like, be innocent as a dove, but crafty as a snake.
Yeah.
So how do you see that sort of balance play out in school setting?
Yeah, and I think it's a good question. I mean, I think, I would never, even though I did a program like Teach for America, which, doesn't have a ton of, some training before you go into the classroom, I wouldn't just recommend for most people going in, like, without some pretty hardcore supports either prior to. I mean, teaching is just hard anywhere, suburbs. I mean, let's not kid ourselves, kids in like suburban wealthy communities have a ton of issues that they're wrestling with too. They just may not be as obvious initially. There's a lot going on in every school in our nation. So it's just incredibly hard. So thinking that we can go without adequate training is just not at all the way to go. And I think once you are in a school, really identifying people that can mentor you through the process, again, regardless of the type of school in which you're teaching, like the mentor piece is huge. There was a teacher next door to me that taught 5th grade that like completely transformed my classroom, because for the first few weeks I had no classroom discipline and management. Kids were like, that was like a party in here. I mean, there was no learning happening for at least maybe until Halloween, maybe. But she really, helped me and like would come and sit in my classroom and watch me, give me feedback. She let me come and watch her. It was just this dynamic, most important professional relationship I've ever had. And so I think being wise enough to find people like that, glom onto them if you have to. They're not always available and not always obvious. Like find them and become a leech. Like, I'm sure you'll be helpful to them too, but like you just need to suck off of them basically all that you possibly can, because otherwise you are kind of going in just with like a hope and a prayer of being able to be successful. Yeah. No, sorry.
So when it comes to more enrichment type classes like art or PE or music, when schools are already struggling to meet the basic requirements, I know these things are really valuable, but what do you think their role should be in a situation where schools are struggling? Do you think these make a big difference in achievement?
It's a tough one. I was on the board of a national charter school network that had an arts-infused curriculum, and so I did a lot of thinking before I joined this board, because honestly I wasn't sure. I was like, does that actually make a difference on achievement? Because for me, I'm so laser focused on making sure kids are ready, college and career ready, probably to a fault, quite frankly. But I actually became much more convinced after being on that board that the arts, infusing arts in sort of the ongoing curriculum, is incredibly helpful, certainly just for motivation on the outset, right? Like it's much more interesting the way they were teaching lessons on a host of levels. So that's how I think about it, probably more so than a separate class. Just because, again, I'm looking at it from an academic standpoint. But certainly, I think there are people that would argue that, certainly it's for some kids, athletics and art and music are a way to just keep them motivated to go to school at all. If they haven't found their passion in other areas. And, oh, by the way, we actually need, I guess we need athletes. No offense to athletes. I guess we need athletes, but I think we definitely need artists and musicians and people that are, actors, and just that just to help our society continue to grow and flourish. I think it's a wonderful part of what we bring to our communities and to each other. So to fully take that away would be a waste. But the bottom line is, if I were a superintendent and I had to make a budget decision between do I get more math resource teachers or cut the orchestra program, I would probably cut the orchestra program. I know that's probably mean and probably not right, but that's probably what I would do. And I think that's what we see happening in a lot of cases, because I would just, again, want the kids to, sorry to all the musicians and the artists in the room, but I just probably would. And again, that's just me, but I think that's we're seeing a lot of superintendents having to make those tough choices, and they're kind of falling their way. That's why institutions like the church and community groups can really, I've seen a lot of people stepping up and providing arts education to public schools, because those budgets are just being slashed dramatically, and we can be a real resource on that front. Yeah.
I know it's a controversial topic, but the whole topic of tenure and how that affects, do you ever think there will be a day when we get beyond tenure, especially with a lot of, because if providing a quality education for children is based off of the quality of teachers that you have in schools, how do you, if there are certain teachers that are not, necessarily performing at that high quality level.
And they've been given chance after chance to.
And they've been given chance after chance, but they still, have that contract based off the tenure that they have, how does.
Yeah. So, I'm from Detroit, so I'm all about the unions, because I have to be, 'cause I'm from Detroit, so let's just caveat. Okay, so that said, I believe in the dignity of work and allowing people to organize, to ensure that they have adequate work conditions. I mean, there's a whole history in our country of why that's important, because humans often exploit other humans. However, when it comes to kids, I see that as a slightly different dynamic than people who are working in a factory who need to have sort of safe conditions and so I actually am pretty frustrated sometimes with the conversations around teacher tenure. You know, first of all, I think when you look at places where there is no teacher tenure, there's no teacher unions, there are plenty of school districts that are struggling who don't have those. So it's not like if you get rid of teacher unions or teacher tenure, like miraculously kids would all of a sudden start to achieve like that. There's no data to suggest that. Do I think there are ways that teachers unions and teacher tenure are potentially hampering what our schools need? Sure, because their interests, their members pay dues as their interests are to their teachers. And I was a member of the teachers union. I recommend it for a host of reasons, probably for most of you. Your choice, obviously. But so I understand sort of that dynamic and why they want to support their members. But when there are places where teachers have been given chances to improve and have just not been able to really give kids what they need, like, again, like I would expect to be fired from my job, and I don't know why we would expect that not to happen in other sectors too. Like, you know, years ago, teacher tenure was started for very legitimate reasons, because a woman, you know, if she were to become pregnant, even if she were married, in many school districts, she couldn't be a teacher anymore because it was a bad appearance of a woman with child, or there were people that were fired because they wanted their cousin to, I mean, all of that has happened in our nation's history, and so there was a real reason for that, those practices and for tenure. There are, you know, a good attorney can pretty much get you anything you need, and so there are a lot of supports that teachers have now that attorneys and just the legal system will protect. And so to have tenure sort of be a lifelong thing that teachers have, like it just doesn't make sense to me when it really is about, are we growing and learning as professionals, and our kids growing and learning, because that's what our role is. There are plenty of people who disagree with me on that topic, but that's, again, my opinion, and based on what I've researched, kind of where I've landed on it. So. Anyone want to talk about Common Core? That's like the next controversial issue after teacher tenure, and like, you know, about school closings too. That's always a fun topic. Yeah. Oh, stretching. Any other questions? Yes.
So I know we've talked a lot about teacher training and teachers being the biggest asset. So in my kind of, I guess, in my view, that seems to start almost at the university level.
Yeah.
So what, is there something that can be done in that place, like at the university level in our training as teachers before we get to the school, so that the teachers that are actually going into the workforce are prepared to be highly effective?
Yes, 100%, 1,000,000% yes. And no one's talking about that. Like, I mean, to try to criticize, like, or even start to suggest that colleges of education, like, need to go and learn from another country, like, what are they doing? Like, it is like the third rail of politics. People are like, no, like, there's just such, I mean, it's almost as bad as criticizing, like, teachers or talking about what teachers' unions may be standing for, if you disagree with that. And I don't know why that is. I really, it's sort of baffling to me, because again, like, assume that none of us are perfect, we're all evolving, the world is changing, like, colleges of education, you know, should change and evolve too. And I think there are some that are doing that a lot, but I don't know why we haven't just, I don't know, dramatically rethought how we train teachers. You know, maybe we need to have 2 years of student teaching in the classroom, or maybe we need to make maybe to make colleges of education a 5-year degree. I mean, I know a lot of us can't afford that, but maybe we need to give more scholarships to, like, get people, I don't know what the answer is. But when you look at other countries, I mean, I think it's Finland, that's one of the highest performing countries in the world. There's this really good book called The Smartest Kids in the World, which if in your spare time, I highly recommend it. But it's phenomenal. It's by an author named Amanda Ripley, and she follows some of the high performing school districts or school systems in other countries, and she follows American kids who are exchange students going to those, and so they're comparing what they're getting over there versus their experience here. It's just fascinating and hysterical all at the same time. But you know, one of the things that she stumbled upon, which is not, I don't know if it's commonly known, but in a lot of other countries, I know in Finland, like, the people that go into teaching, like, it's so rigorous to become a teacher that it like weeds out people like organic chemistry weeding me out from going to medical school. Like it has that same type of like, you better like seriously bring your A game if you want to be a teacher, because, you know, just to be able to teach Finnish literature, you almost had to get like a PhD in Finnish literature. I mean, the people that were going to teach high school, you know, literature in that country were like going so deep into text. It was like rigorous and intense. And so as a result, like teachers were respected more, they were paid more, although I don't think much more, maybe a little bit more, but there was just a level of rigor. And so then when you ask them questions about like, should all kids, you know, can we teach low-income kids in this country to achieve at high levels, they were like, well, of course, we're gonna take the same approach, like we learn rigorous literature, of course, every kid, it was just a different mindset. I mean, you have to read the book to fully get your head around it, and I don't know what that means for colleges of education in our country, other than that we probably need to rethink everything, I would imagine, about the way we train teachers in this country, because we want our teachers to be well prepared, and I think, I don't know what the data is, but I think a lot of teachers, when they get in the classroom, again, whether we're going to teach in Compton or Beverly Hills, feel like, oh my gosh, like, I need so much more. And maybe we're always gonna feel that way because it's such a get in there and kind of figure it out to some extent job, I don't know. But it does seem like there's more we could be doing to rethink how we train teachers, and it just seems to not be the most popular topic.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
We actually have to wrap up. So, right now, well, let's give Nicole a hand for a moment.